Hello, everybody. On today's episode of the Sun and Soil podcast, we're going to be doing a little bit of a mini deep dive into hemp and its uses as an alternative to cotton and some interesting history facts about it. It should be noted that hemp is distinct from marijuana. I think a lot of people at this point understand that. A couple years ago, that probably wasn't the case. There was still a lot of confusion, and there still is a lot of confusion today. So just to reiterate, hemp is distinct from marijuana. Marijuana is like the boisterous sibling that, goes through high school earlier than hemp. And by the time hemp gets around to high school, they already have a reputation built for themselves by their older sibling that, behaved a little poorly maybe. And so hemp kind of got a bad rap, but we're trying to straighten out some of the nonsense. So regardless, I hope you enjoy. I hope you learned something, and thank you for listening.
Long ago, when these ancient Grecian temples were new, hemp was already old in the service of mankind. For thousands of years even then, this plant had been grown for cordage and coarse cloth in China and elsewhere in the East. For centuries prior to about 1850, all the ships that sailed the western seas were rigged with hempen rope and sails. For the sailor, no less than the hangman, hemp was indispensable.
So what you just heard was a World War II video made by the U.S. government, and it called farmers to plant hemp. This was needed in World War II because hemp was used as fiber for ropes needed in battleships and a lot of other wartime effort. Hemp needed this PR boost from the U.S. government because American farmers weren't planting hemp. And that's because way back when, in 1937, there was something passed called the Marijuana Tax Act. Now, this targeted marijuana, not hemp, but due to the familial resemblance, the tax implications and requirements for growing marijuana made it very uneconomical and unpopular to grow hemp just due to the fact they look so similar. And you could get in trouble for growing marijuana without the proper tax stamps, and there was all this fuss. Fast forward to 1970, once again, hemp got in a little bit of trouble when the Controlled Substance Act put hemp, along with marijuana, in Schedule 1, making it officially illegal for hemp to be grown in the U.S. And the legal status of hemp remained largely stagnant from the 1970s all the way to 2018, when the Hemp Farming Act was passed under the larger 2018 Farm Bill that you might have heard of. Now, this measure descheduled hemp and made it viewed as a normal agricultural commodity under the eyes of the law. So, big news for the U.S. farmers. They're now able to grow hemp without any legal implications. So the first legal crops of hemp can be grown in the U.S. But really, ironically, there are still many vegetative vestiges of the hemp farming that occurred during World War II. There's a real reason that, hemp, marijuana, it's called weed. It grows like one. These things grow fast. And during the Hemp for Victory days, a lot of the Midwest had fields planted along the banks of rivers all throughout the country. And when the farming ended after World War II, the need for fiber was not as great. A lot of these plants ended up escaping. And despite the government's best efforts in the coming years, hemp plants can still be found growing in areas around rivers and on the sides of roadways. And from some Midwesterners that I've heard speak about it, they've referred to it locally as ditchweed. If you'd like to see this ditchweed for yourself, there's a great channel called Crime Pays But Botany Doesn't, and he has a video on his channel depicting the escaped hemp that's still growing in, I think, Nebraska. We'll include a link to him. He's just creates great YouTube content. It's wonderful. Industrial hemp, when it's grown, is very long, tall, with a very thick and fibrous center stalk. It can grow to like 14 feet. It's surprisingly tall. But now, if we kind of look at the worldwide history of hemp and dig into what happened before it was banned in the U.S., long before it was an outlaw here in America, hemp was likely one of the first crops humans domesticated. And although hemp's close relative, marijuana, gets a lot of the attention, hemp has been a major player in humans' conquest of the world. Hemp and marijuana's involvement with humans have often traveled together, obviously, but they have fulfilled very different roles in our societies. Cannabis sativa, the plant from which hemp and marijuana are both derived from, originates in Asia. And it's hard to exactly determine where it first took root, but very early records of cultivation of hemp begin in what is now modern-day China. And thanks to these archaeological records, they depict hemp fiber being used all the way back to the Neolithic era. That is an approximate end date of 1900 BC. And the use of hemp fiber for clothing and eventually paper elevated hemp to a prominent place within ancient China. China being referred to as the land of mulberry and hemp, mulberry being the food for silkworms. So from China, cultivation of hemp spread westward towards Europe over the subsequent centuries, and the canvas used for sails was made out of hemp fiber, and the actual word canvas is derived from cannabis. But due to the undeniable functionality of hemp, the plant garnered a great importance in every society that it was introduced to. Hemp was of such, value that England required every property owner in their Jamestown colony to grow 100 hemp plants for export. And from the beginning, the story of America is very much weaved together with the story of hemp, figuratively and literally. You've probably heard your freaking stoner cousin say that many of the founding fathers, like George Washington and John Adams, were growing weed. And they weren't growing weed, they were growing hemp for fiber purposes. And yes, the first American flags woven were made of hemp fiber. And so, to the disappointment of your stoner cousin, the founding fathers were not getting high. They were growing fiber. And until the 20th century, hemp remained an important agricultural commodity for the U.S. It was used in, like I said, the making of ropes and textiles. Then the two plants, marijuana and hemp, that had followed mankind through much of our history, were subject to a nationwide smear campaign, as I mentioned in the introduction. For thousands of years, hemp had clothed us, fed us, and gotten us across oceans, but we abandoned hemp in the 20th century and banned it in the U.S., but we've recently reallowed the growing of hemp in America. We've made it legal, so that's got to be for some reason. Now, with the recent changes in the law surrounding hemp, what role does hemp play in the 21st century and beyond? I want to look at one of the ways that hemp can make our agricultural and consumer system a little bit more sustainable. I want to look at how hemp can help us with the first thing we used hemp for, and that's textiles, fiber, clothing. The textile or fashion industry is one of the biggest polluters on the planet, accounting for roughly 10% of the global greenhouse gas emission. The big player in the fashion and textile industry is cotton. We all know that. But what a lot of people don't know is that cotton, or king cotton as it's sometimes referred to, is an incredibly resource-intensive crop. A very gluttonous king, one might say. To start off, cotton requires roughly 10,000 liters of water to grow only 1 kilogram of dry matter, and that's according to research done in the UK. And the same study estimated that by using traditional hemp processing techniques, approximately 350 liters of water would be required to produce 1 kilogram of usable dry matter. Secondly, in regards to overall CO2 emissions, the winner greatly depends on if you're looking at organic hemp versus organic cotton, or traditional hemp versus traditional cotton, and whatnot. For traditional cotton, a majority of the CO2 emissions comes from the actual growing of the plant as opposed to the fiber processing, and that's due to the immense amount of petroleum-based fertilizers that are used to grow cotton. When comparing traditional cotton to traditional hemp, hemp is once again the winner. Hemp produces 2 kilograms of CO2 emissions per ton of fiber spun at the agricultural stage of production, in comparison to 4 kilograms of CO2 emissions per ton of fiber spun for cotton. But there are a lot more factors to consider than just water and CO2 emissions. One big factor that needs to be accounted for in the hemp versus cotton debate is the land needed to grow both products. If you've ever seen a picture of a hemp field, you've probably seen very densely planted and tall stalks. Just the way that the hemp plant grows, it doesn't need as much land as the more widely spaced cotton plants. And that UK study estimates that both organic and traditional hemp require about 1 hectare of land in order to produce 1 ton of spun fiber. In contrast, cotton requires 2.5 hectares of land in order to produce the same amount of fiber. In addition, hemp grows like a weed, hence its name. It has a very short harvest cycle of 120 days. In comparison to cotton, that's a 160-day harvest cycle. And of course, I think I mentioned earlier that one of the big comparisons between whether or not to grow hemp or cotton comes down to pesticide use. Cotton is a notoriously pesticide-intensive crop, taking up to 11% of the world's total pesticides. And there are two main types of pesticides used in regards to cotton. Herbicides, used to curtail weed growth around the plant, and what are known as defoliants, used to kill the plant's outer foliage just before the mechanical cotton picker comes to harvest the cotton. And hemp has a unique advantage that it grows very tall and can be densely planted, and this makes it so that the hemp can choke out most weeds by hogging a lot of the sunlight. Think about a forest with a canopy. Not a lot of light gets through the bottom. Same with hemp. Not a lot of light gets to the bottom, and weeds just can't grow. Cotton, like I said before, short plants, widely spaced, requires a lot of herbicides to battle and outcompete the weeds that would pop up. A common myth that floats around when talking about hemp is that it's highly pest resistant and that it doesn't require any pesticides, and that's not true. Hemp does require some pesticides, not as much as cotton, not the same types as cotton, but it does, and a lot of the research is still rolling out. Remember, there was a long ban on hemp and therefore a long ban on research. So there's still a lot of science to be done on the basics of hemp, but it does require pesticides, not as much as cotton though. But I think one of the big things to point out is that hemp has a very natural form of weed suppression, just in the way that it grows. I think it's a very attractive alternative to cotton because much of the world's cotton production is occurring in places like India and Africa, where regulations, access to PPE, and infrastructure is strained, and the potential for pesticides to be used in an irresponsible way in these countries is exponentially higher. Even in the US, where we have stronger regulations, stronger access to PPE, when cotton fields are crop dusted, there are incidences that the pesticides seep into local water, and of course, studies have been done to show that the pesticides used in cotton production can cause immense harm to these rural third world communities. Hemp is a truly remarkable plant, and even though right now marijuana might get a little bit more attention, I think that a lot of people will begin to realize that hemp is a real power player in the family. We're constantly figuring out how to use this plant in more ways, and there are literally thousands of applications for hemp and its derivatives, from bioplastics to heavy metal cleanup. I chose only to look at how hemp can be used in the textile industry as an alternative to cotton and some of the benefits of doing so. And I think there is a tendency for people in the pro-hemp community to make the plant seem like it's a cure-all for all our problems. It can be used for this, that, everything. And like I said before, there is no panacea, but hemp does play an essential role in that puzzle, figuring out how we're going to live a more sustainable future. And I think these grandiose claims by the plant's most fervent supporters is more a result of the long-term ban. They feel as if they really got to get behind hemp. Regardless, I think people do see the value in this plant, and I just hope we don't mess everything up a second time and figure out how to make this plant work for us. With all that said, I truly hope that going into the future, there can be more room in the textile industry for fibers like hemp and maybe even other fibers that we're not quite aware of yet that are better than cotton. Cotton is the king, but there can be alternatives. Thank you for listening to the Sun and Soil podcast. My name is Noah Spickelmeyer. I hope you have a wonderful day. Anything mentioned in the episode will be included in the show notes. So thank you very much, and have a good one.
Hemp for victory.